My name is Claudia Hittay. I work for the Environmental Ministry. I used to work for the Luxembourg Institute for Science and Technology as an environmental economist. I studied in the United States, just to prepare you for American accents later on. I'd like to ask the panelists to come up front and sit down, and I'm going to introduce them. First, we have online Georg Rebernig. Yes, please sit down. Since 1999, he's been director of the Austrian Environmental Office. Before that, he was an environmental attaché of the permanent representation of Austria in Brussels. Mr. Rebernig has a particular interest in European sustainability topics and participates in a number of network activities in the framework in the network of heads of environmental agencies. Welcome. Then we have Laura Gehlkopf, who is ESG coordinator as the CSSF, the Commission de Surveillance du Secteur Financier here at the Luxembourg, the supervisory authorities. She advises the board on ESG strategies, topics, and makes sure that the CSFF uses sustainable finance. Easy task. She used to work as a legal expert in the international regulation department for collective investment funds of the CSSF. Then my colleague, André Weidenhaupt, since from 2005 to 2015, he was the director of the Luxembourg Water Utilities Administration de Gestion de l'Eau here in Luxembourg, and since 2014, André Weidenhaupt is Director General of the Luxembourg Ministry for the Environment, Climate and Sustainable Development, not finance, sustainable development. That's a Freudian slip. No. Very good. So I added an additional topic to your title. He's also head of the board of the European Environmental Agency and is vice president of the board. So let me introduce the topic for today's panel, the keynote speeches this morning. Oh my God, I forgot one. I forgot one speaker. I don't have the biography because it was introduced already. And I'm pleased. So I haven't heard such a good comparison. So very good presentation. So we had some very interesting keynote speeches this morning. The climate price, biodiversity crisis, the physical risks, etc. We got an overview of all that. The requirements to the actors of the world of finance are diverse and are formulated by a number of actors. So we have on the one hand the European and the national legislators. We have initiatives from the world of finance, Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, Net Zero Banking Alliance, or Principle for a Responsible Investment. Then we have the customers, private households, institutional investors, companies, corporate investors, civil society, NGOs, research, where I used to work before, then the financial authorities at international, European and national level, the non-public standard setters and gatekeepers, IFRS, International Financial Recording Standards, with the ISSSB, the Standards Boards, Global Reporting Initiative, GRI, ISO, labeling agencies. Hello, Isabelle Tella, who is here. She's from LuxLight, from the Luxembourg Finance Labeling Agency. So if there are questions on labeling, please use the breaks. Talk to Isabelle. Please raise your hand. There she is. There she is. So the requirements formulated by all these actors are not always congruent or not achievable without conflicts of objectives, and they distinguish in terms of content and in terms of timelines. The question as to whether green finance is effective is not easy to answer. You also need to know lots of acronyms, and that's why I'm pleased I don't have to answer this question, but the people here sitting beside me. I'm going to say two things. One of the questions is whether the green finance framework and the redirection of financial flows will make sure that companies effectively transform the production towards more sustainable production. And secondly, the regulatory work of the EU Commission in the field of green finance is huge, as we all know. There is criticism on the ambitious speed and the procedure of the new instruments, the taxonomy before CSRD and ISRS. So the question is this all these efforts justified to achieve the objectives? Where do we need to correct? So that was my introduction. Now we start, and let's start with Mr. Rebernig, our guest from Austria. Same question I will ask Mr. Weidenhaupt, so we have a comparison between Austria and Luxembourg. At what levels do you see positive changes when we talk about biodiversity and climate protection? Mr. Rebernig. Thank you very much. I would like to start. First, I apologize for not being there in person, because there was the threat of strikes in Germany, the German railways, and I was afraid not to reach you in time. So this was safer. My second point, I would like to thank the colleagues from Luxembourg for organizing this conference. I would also like to thank two other offices, the Environmental Office in Dessau and the Swiss Environmental Office, that we can organize this conference together. I'd also like to thank my team in Vienna under the leadership of Nathalie Klaas, who has been dealing with this topic for quite a long time and has also briefed me for my presentation here today. So, at what levels do we see positive changes? If we take the scientific level, and I take the report of Andrew Ferroni, I must say his report leaves us very frightened. Unfortunately, the success that we have achieved in reducing greenhouse gas emissions are not moving forward quickly enough. We're still on the target path, but we see with the existing measures, and we're very much involved, our office is very much involved in this type of calculations, that with the current measures we are not going to achieve the 2030 objectives of the EU. And that there is a lot of work still to do. Our biggest concern in Austria is transport and emissions generated by transport, by mobility. And in other areas, it's probably possible to speed up our efforts. There is a question about the pace that we need to discuss. So we need more speed in all these areas at the political level. And I think everybody knows that. The Green Deal and particularly the Fit for 55 package is very impressive. It's impressive what the European Commission and Europe is trying to achieve. I'm not going to go into the detail of the various elements. And coincidentally, we have some similar developments at the national level. The Austrian national legislation, or the government, wants to achieve climate neutrality by 2040. That dates back to 2020. And lots of things have happened at political level. We have a legislation on renewable energy, a very ambitious legislation. We have the climate ticket. We have support, substantial support to leave oil and gas. We have an eco-social tax reform with the interesting aspect that the money will be given back to the population per capita. Very interesting construct that we introduced, and the tax rate is going to increase over the coming years. So we were successful there also. This will help developing renewable energies. Nevertheless, as my last point in my first contribution, the political debate, and we are very much interested in that, we as environmental offices, this debate is is getting a certain dynamics, which is not only going in a positive direction. We had this discussion on the ban of ICEs, the importance of e-fuels. This is going in the wrong directions. When we talk about internal combustion engines, there is resistance at European level also from a number of groups against the Restoration Act. They say that climate protection needs to be measured and moderate. So on account of the coming European elections 2024, probably the political discussion will be more controversial, and it's important that we as environmental officers should make our contribution so that the debate is very factual and target-oriented. Thank you very much. Should I repeat the question? Yes, I heard your question. I would also like to thank the organizers and particularly my dear colleagues from the Luxembourg Environmental Administration, but also our colleagues in the other German-speaking environmental ministries. This is the fourth time that I attend such a conference. It's always very interesting, again, and therefore many thanks from my side. Claudia, you asked about the various levels, positive levels. I see a number of positive developments, and you also ask about biodiversity and climate protection. If we go to the global level, in my view, as far as biodiversity is concerned, lots of things have been achieved in December last year in Montreal with the Montreal Global Diversity Framework and with the commitment there. And the French colleague of the French Central Bank mentioned that already, the commitment that as of 2030, $200 billion will be made available for national and global biodiversity protection. That's essential. This is a framework as we have known it since Copenhagen for climate protection, with a $100 billion objective, which will now become a more ambitious objective. Everybody's going to say we only achieved 80 billion, but probably this year we're going to reach the 100 billion. So this is what I learned at the G7 meeting. At least the feedback from the German environment minister last Friday morning when we met with the other environmental ministers of the German-speaking world. So globally, as far as finance is concerned for the two crises, it's a positive framework that is developing, even if I don't need to repeat everything, even at global level we're not necessarily on the right track that we should be. But at national level in Luxembourg, we're on the right path with the same challenges as our Austrian colleague has just said. We also, for Austria, we also have a challenge for the transport sector, the mobility sector. So we're on track currently. We have a climate legislation, and we have fixed more ambitious objectives than the ones imposed by the EU via the effort-sharing regulation. This being said, Luxembourg, end of March, in our government council, and on the 17th of April, with the public event, the public consultation, we launched a public consultation for the update of our national energy and climate plan. You can still write us until today, so my appeal to you, for those who haven't done so yet, it was a bit challenging. You had 1 month time, but to be able to achieve our climate objectives, all our measures need to be checked. And now we have 197 measures, some new measures. We're right on track. with the consultation, the whole process is going until mid next year, until the updated plan is ready. But as in Austria, in Luxembourg, we have a CO2 tax. It's been around for 2 years. The mechanism is slightly different to give the money back to the people, not exactly the same as in Austria. Half of the income goes via social measures, so it's a tax credit for climate and an increase of social support for those who are entitled to this, and the other half goes back via support for climate protection. So the money goes back to the population. It's a bit more complex and a bit more differentiated than in Austria, but still, in principle, we try, in principle, to keep the money turning in the climate system, if I may put it that way. Then at the local level, last but not least, in Luxembourg, for some time, there is the climate pact with the municipalities, and this climate pact is in its second edition with more quantitative objectives. All except one municipality are members. We only have 102 municipalities. As of the next municipal elections on the 11th of June, all will be members because there will be two mergers, and then everybody will be in. It's a voluntary system, but once you're in, you need to comply with a number of rules, and depending on your performance, you get more or less support. So it's a carrot and a stick system, but it works. Since this was successful, we did the same for nature protection 2 years ago, the climate pact for municipalities. We're not making progress so quickly, but it also started very well. So these are my positive messages at global, EU, and national level, and even the local level. And maybe I was a bit long in my response. So if you're speaking longer on positive aspects, that's always nice. Next question goes to Mr. Gehlkopf. Mrs. Gehlkopf.
On behalf of not speaking German, let me answer on behalf of the audience. No apology necessary. I'll ask you the questions in English, no problem at all. So you are with the CSSF, like I just said. The question is, how does the implementation of SFDR, in particular the obligation from MiFID II, to ask clients about their sustainability preferences, how does this work out in practice? What changes does the CSSF perceive? And what feedback do you get from your stakeholders and from within your own ranks?
So we talked earlier about the necessity to make sure that financing is now diverted to investments that support the transition. And in the implementation of the sustainable finance framework, one of the main pillars to achieve that is investor information and transparency. So that's SFDR and the integration of sustainability preferences in the suitability assessment that is required under MiFID. And even according to ESMA, the assessment of suitability is one of the most important requirements for investor protection. Last year, at the CSSF, we tried to take stock of what was happening on the market, how sustainable finance was being perceived by also retail investors, the general public. And the survey found that there is a global interest for sustainable products in terms of investments. But when you ask the general public what they say, that it's a complex subject, it's difficult to understand, and they consider that bankers or financial advisors are a source of reference, of information and trust to make sure that they can direct their funds into sustainable investments. And this obligation from MiFID to take into account sustainability preferences, I think it's trying to leverage on that role of bankers and how financial advisors can help their clients understand the sustainability features of potential investments. the objective is that these features are explained in a clear and understandable language. I don't think we're quite there yet. What we're seeing is that this is going to be a challenge for financial advisors and bankers to fulfill that role. And notably, there's been ESMA guidelines that have been published recently, and they will become applicable on the 3rd of October. And there's 2 sets of guidelines, but I'm not going to go into the details. And what we're hearing from the industry is that there is a steep learning curve to be able to implement those requirements and the guidelines. At the CSSF, we're also trusting that there is sufficient expertise on the market to be able to implement these properly. So I also want to have a positive message here that there is a lot of expertise in Luxembourg, and we trust that bankers and financial advisors that have been able to implement the MiFID rule and the suitability assessments before, because that's not a new requirement, that they will be able to onboard the sustainability preference. It's a bit early to draw conclusions as to the complete impact of those rules, but as I said, we're still in the early implementation works. So.
Thank you. Herr Thome.
Mr. Thome, we heard about trends in green finance from you. Do you believe that the necessary coming international consolidation of all the standards, that this will last to take a long time, or do you think that the high European ambitions will be lowered down in the medium term? Thank you very much. Yes, it will take a long time. Bad news will take a long time. I'm putting my foot on the brake, and we don't know what shape it will have at the end of the day. I talked in my presentation about the differences in the stress test results. Just to emphasize it again, we're talking about a situation where the input data of the companies are the same, financial data, the environmental data, the model is the same. The only thing that changes is the input scenario. The input scenario, which is changing, has the same CO2 ambition. So it's not the 2-degree or a 6-degree scenario. We input various IAM scenarios with more or less the same CO2 budgets. It's still, we have dramatic differences, and even if there is an international consolidation, we must expect that these differences will remain in a certain form. The positive news is that I don't believe that the high European ambition will be watered down. This is a leading question, if I may say. It suggests that the European ambition is very high. But in fact, I think that because of the mechanisms of trade policy, there will be an approximation to the European ambition levels. We see this in the free trade agreements that are being negotiated in different regions and countries. That the taxonomy also plays a role there in these negotiations. And I think at the end of the day, there will be an approximation to the European level, not a watering down of the various standards. What may happen is that the threat will come from the inside, because you need to be consistent, of course. I use Star Wars. Now, the rest of the day, I need to speak in Star Wars terms. I'm sorry. So that's the one-dimensional German speaking to you here today. So we talked about this in the coffee break, whether renewable energies will be part of the taxonomy in the medium term, because they're competitive in Europe, and they don't need any incentive through green finance, and whether at this ambition level, the ambition level will be manifest itself by the fact that you don't need to achieve every last efficiency standard, but you want to boast that you have a green impact. You also need to tackle the difficult technologies. You need to tackle the hard-to-abate sectors, industry, aviation, etc., and the very difficult clusters. So when you are a European bank, you not only work with big credits, but also for small and medium-sized companies. So this, in this focus, this is where the ambition level will be difficult. This will be a long process, but we will keep the same level of ambition. You've mentioned something very important there. The taxonomy and the standards are sometimes so complex that it's easier to invest in simple things. And that has a blocking effect, probably, to invest in matters which, from the data, or which are more difficult in other countries, to justify that this is a good thing for the climate or for biodiversity. But these are the investments that we need. We'll probably talk about that in our third panel. Absolutely. Just one addition. One great example is if I take a fund is 10% taxonomy aligned or 1% taxonomy aligned, but the 10% are renewable energies of European big utility companies, and the 1% is alternative heating methods, CO2 neutral for the industry. What has more impact? What is more impact oriented? What is the more interesting fund? 1% or 10%? And this is exactly the question that the politicians need to ask themselves. Now, where does Luxembourg stand in the green finance landscape? What are your requirements? And is there a monitoring to measure whether you have achieved the objective? Good luck. So this 1%. So not only 1 or 10%, but even more, I would say. But that was just a joke. So where does Luxembourg stand in the landscape? We were pioneers in a number of areas. We were pioneers, as was mentioned here today already, in labeling with the Luxembourg Finance Labeling Agency, LuxFlag. That's the acronym. It's also a nice pun, LuxFlag. Then we were also pioneers in the field of the green exchange, where about half of the assets under management across the world are green bonds, are listed as green bonds. And it has some reasons. There are some reasons. The first green bond listed, when there was no green exchange yet, was a bond of the EIB. It was next door, very easy. Then KfW also came in, and they could have gone to Frankfurt. It would have been closer, but they did come to Luxembourg. Nice. So we were pioneers, and therefore we structured the thing a little bit together with the Ministry of Finance, or the Ministry of Finance together with us. Depends how you see things, but apparently we're also a Ministry of Finance, as you said earlier on, the Luxembourg Sustainable Finance Initiative. So otherwise, climate and energy always go together, but we can innovate now, climate and finance, with the next government. So, but I have to shut up because we have elections coming up. So we have the Luxembourg Finance Initiative that we started, and for us it's important that the whole thing remains credible, that we don't fall into greenwashing, as our colleague Tom may also mentioned. I think we see things in a more differentiated way. We support Austria in a complaint. Mr. Tomé was saying that perhaps one should not include the renewable energies in the taxonomy. We were shocked when the additional legal act was added, when gas and nuclear energy was to be added, and we were pleased that the Austrians complained against that, and we support them. I would like to say this publicly. So thank you very much, Austria, for your initiative, and you have our full support for this. And it will be important that we remain credible, and we can only remain credible if we follow certain rules. We can only remain credible if if we use robust data. This is not a plea to generate more data, but we do need reliable figures, robust data, so that we don't fall into greenwashing, because Mr. Tomé also said so. I don't know under which episode of Star Wars he mentioned this. I'm sorry that I don't remember this exactly, which episode it was. But he also said we need to keep an eye on the NGOs. The NGOs are important. If we're not on track, it is important that people tell us, but this should not prevent us from taking the journey that we find is the right one as national authorities. But we need to take a journey so not too much spending, but following certain rules. That's what I would say. Thank you very much. Let's take a look at Austria. Mr. Rebernig, my next question goes to you. Austria is a pioneer in some areas of sustainability. 1/3 of agricultural land is managed in an organic way. Also in green finance, Austria is very active. Last week, I participated or heard about the meeting of the 5 environmental officers. What are your ambitions? How do you want to implement them and evaluate and correct them?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. Maybe I could bring up 2 aspects. One in particular from the previous discussion, gas and nuclear and taxonomy. Well, especially politically, this is leading to problems. Also in communication, I think that taxonomy has not deserved to be taken into such a discussion. The value of taxonomy, well, I'd like to come back to that later on, still above and beyond the green finance topic. And another discussion that has been launched a little bit by Jakob Thome, more particularly the width and the degree of innovation. So personally, I would say that we need the width, so it has to be a broad approach. A lot of technologies are available, they are present on the market. We have renewables, we have technologies for building sanitation, we have public transportation approaches, we have heat pumps. So the more green finance can contribute to have things existing already brought into a broad approach, the better for the transformation. Coming back to your question, thank you for the compliment concerning Austria's ambition in a whole series of areas already. Well, concerning green finance, we have, just as in many other countries already, a whole series and a growing number of voluntary initiatives, private sector, public sector, being brought together here. Allow me to mention what we are doing in the green finance aspects, different guides, one particularly linked to renewable energies and the legislation in this area. Renewable energy communities are foreseen, including a financial aspect or a funding structuration aspect, linked to the question what's happening to electricity being generated by these installations beyond the own usage, so surplus volumes, and this is linked to financial products as well. Another initiative I'd like to mention is the Green Investment Pioneers Program. This is about an approach where small investment needs are bundled into a project pipeline and made it interesting for bigger investors as well. And then a few legal initiatives, one from the public area with the finance market supervision and the Austrian financing administration, finance ministry, climate ministry, and our own experts. We have been working together. The Federal Financing Agency has launched a green bond framework that had to be established, and 2 tranches of green bonds have been launched in the public area. The first one last year in autumn, and the second on the 18th of April this year. And we have a volume here of 8.7 billion euros that have been made available in these bonds, and this is quite impressive. The green funding initiative you've been mentioning is publicly sponsored, but implemented by different actors or the private sector, different actors on the finance market. These finance market actors are committing to the 1.5 degree objective to be pursued in all their activities and operational areas. And there's monitoring obligations here to really do everything to reach this objective. And this is one of the most ambitious initiatives in this area as a whole. And as a federal agency in Austria, we're quite proud to have been involved in this in a major way. Thank you very much. Let me ask for clarification in case you know it by heart. How many institutions are involved at the Green Finance Alliance? No, it's 10 completely right now. Some of the actors, smaller ones of the financial market, a few bigger ones as well, and this is reflected in the sums as well. 24,000 co-workers are involved in banks, insurance companies, pension funds, with an amount of almost 200 billion euros. So this is quite a volume now developed already. Thank you very much. Mr. Tommy, let's talk about data now. We all know that there's a lack of data concerning the environmental aspect, social impacts also of investments to be measured. And on the one hand, it is quite difficult for the financial actors to really show the real impact, and it's difficult to measure it also and to see whether green finance is having an effect. This was a key question. That's why I'm happy to convey this question to you. From your point of view, what steps are necessary from your point of view in order to make sure that the impact of green finance tools can be more efficient? Thank you very much. And I have the privilege to be in the consultative committee of the Green Finance as well. And what I would like to indicate more particularly within this initiative is that I know a lot of initiatives where quantity is brought up first and quality second. And it's quite impressive to see how many institutions and co-workers are involved here, but also the enormously high and the worldwide highest level of investment that I've seen for this kind of initiative. So this is really remarkable, and also a sign of courage to have quality as number one, even though certain institutions might be chased away due to this. So one more compliment for our virtual screen here. So three things more particularly concerning your question. One major problem for the impact toolkit or the impact data is that there's certain rules that are not followed. And the most fundamental rule here that I see is the one that we have in the DAG protocol, the Greenhouse Gas Accounting Standard, and also in the finance sector PICAF, Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials. So a distinction to be made between virtual and real emission reductions. So in the GG protocol scope, standard 3, it's involved meaning. When I have sold a power plant, I cannot measure it as an emission reduction. It's virtual emission transfer. It has to be reflected like that. And in the financial market, no one is respected. And when I say no one, I mean 0%. We have had a look at 80 PICAF signatories. 0% of the financial institutions are respecting this. You cannot measure impact if you do not distinguish between virtual and real distinctions here. So this is not a causality calculation. It's a fundamental base in order to make sure whether anything happened at all before the question who was responsible for it. Second element, unfortunately also still not to be found in the toolkit, impact management systems. So we have a risk management system. You measure the risks, and then risk mitigating measures are being taken to be launched, buying hedges and so on. So an impact management system means you measure outputs, you measure outcomes, and you measure impacts. And what we are having now in the reporting and in the regulatory framework is only outputs at the maximum. So you're only seeing what has been transferred within my portfolio. Do I have made any climate lobbying at all? But the real emissions reductions and causality chains to be thought till the very end are not implemented. You had the topic of steep learning curves just beforehand, but I cannot follow along and see how we have GFAN signatories or other science-based signatories, and not such a system, not necessarily to have causality once again in every aspect and every moment in time to be proven. We know that's very difficult, but you cannot have an approach to the topic if you don't get started with it. And this is actually the major problem for me here. And that's why we think quite often in the discussions, more data. This has been mentioned already, what kind of impact data, emissions data, blah, blah, blah. Yes, but the two other components that I would like to underline even more, because they're not on the market, are the two others I mentioned. And maybe one last point, if I may, what's important here as well is to identify whether we want to have an impact. And unfortunately, quite often this is being watered down, be it products where via MiFID they are distributed among small investors, ESG products are being mentioned and sold to people who want to change the world and not reduce in their investment strategy, or vegan consumers who want portfolios without animal products. So an animal engagement strategy is not of interest to them. For instance, when I'm a Muslim, I don't want to have a portfolio where there's an engagement with alcohol-producing companies. I do not want to invest in these products. Distinguish, I don't want to touch it. I want to manage risk. I want to change the world. The distinguishing factors between these are quite confusing. NGOs are indicating a fund has no impact, and the fund says we don't want to have an impact here. And this is the decisive point here. Without this clarification, we can't have any further progress. Okay, thank you very much. Well, I think the story with the avoided emissions is hair-raising as well, to see all the things you can do. If you have wind power stations to be built on an island where the baseline emissions are linked to an old oil-based plant, and until sunset you can sell these products forever. Even now, this should not be allowed as a base anymore, and certainly not in 20 years from now. And yes, very well presented what's going on there. So if you ask someone in the streets what is sustainable finance for you, you will be rather in the impact area than in the ESG risk management area. Yes, and so this is shown by interviews and certainly in the European-wide service. This is being commented.
Supervisory authorities with the national authorities. How does that work in the area of green finance? In addition, do you think that the supervisory authorities have been given the appropriate means to accompany and monitor the implementation of the green finance agenda?
So broadly speaking, the ESAs, they have a role in monitoring market practices, and they also have a role in policy work. And NCAs are represented at different groups and subgroups of the various ESAs. So myself, I represent the CSSF at the Sustainability Standing Committee at ESMA, for instance, but I also have other colleagues that are in the EBA subgroups or groups. And the idea of these European authorities is to fulfill several roles. I'll give you a quick overview. First, of course, is the policy work. Of course, in the area of sustainable finance, there's still a lot of inconsistencies that needs to be worked out. We need to stabilize the framework, and a lot of this work and exchange on these matters is done at this level, and the ESAs, they support the European Commission in that respect. There's, for instance, at the moment, the ESAs have been mandated by the European Commission to draw up a report on greenwashing. The interim report is supposed to be issued really soon, by the end of May, I think, and then next year there's going to be a final report. So there's a lot of policy work done at that level. Another important role is convergence work. I think many of the speakers have also spoken about the importance of being aligned at European level and hopefully sometimes worldwide even. So a lot of the role of the ESAs is to ensure that convergence through exchange of knowledge. There's a discussion about supervisory cases also happening at that level. And there's a number of supervision exercises that are also implemented, and notably the common supervisory actions. And then, of course, assessing and addressing the risks and the vulnerability of the EU financial sector. It's an important part of the work that is done with the ESAs. And I mean, I'm not going to dwell into that or go deeper into detail into that. The colleague from the Banque de France already talked about risk assessment and the importance of integrating ESG risks. And I think she already, in that context, mentioned the latest, the EU Commission has mandated the ESAs to do climate stress test risks also. So broadly speaking, that's what the ESAs do, and all the NCAs participate in those groups and subgroups. And an important part of the CSSF is actually to represent Luxembourg in those groups and participate in the policy work and convergence work. Now, onto your trickier question about the means and whether we have the means available to monitor the implementation of the sustainable finance agenda. I think it's a tricky question to answer. It's a good question because it also questions whether we really need new means, or do we have the means here already and we just need to onboard ESG and sustainability. And I think we've touched upon this, other panelists have touched upon this, but maybe I should insist on that message. At the CSSF, we think that the priority right now for financial organization should be to integrate and ingrain sustainability into their existing models. So they already have governance models, they already have risk assessment procedure. They already, for instance, now know how to do a suitability assessment within the MiFID framework. What needs to be done is they should integrate ESG into this governance system, into the traditional mechanisms that are already there. And I only think that we can only achieve the agenda if we leverage on what's already there, rather than make ESG a standalone. And I was going to take myself also as an example, is that you have those new roles that have emerged that are ESG-centric, but I mean, we have the Andrew Farron from the IPCC, who said we only have 2 or 3 years to make sure that we take enough actions before the window is closing. And I hope within this amount of years, ESG-centric roles will not be necessary anymore. So we're here to push everything into the existing systems. And then hopefully everything that is ESG sustainability related will have been taken on board and integrated into the existing process that we have.
Thank you for that. Of course, enforcement is the key ingredient to make the entire regulatory framework work.
Yes. And I mean, at the CSSF, that's what we're working on at the moment. We've published our supervision priorities, and a lot of them are centered about making sure that ESG is being integrated into governance of existing organization now.
Thank you. So now I have a bonus round of questions for anyone who cares to answer. Audience, no. The panelists. To me, this is really the key question. Glauben Sie, dass wir dahin kommen, dass konsistent und kausal nachvollziehbar sein wird, welche Wirkung im Detail ein Finanzprodukt auf die Umwelt hat und umgekehrt, also welche Wirkung das Finanzprodukt, die Umwelt auf den Finanzwert oder das Finanzprodukt hat? Können wir das messen und aufzeigen? Und hier wollte ich noch mal hinweisen, einmal ganz generell Umwelt, Klima und vielleicht auch Biodiversität. Wie gut kriegen wir das hin?
Das ist im Prinzip die Frage der Internalisierung externer Kosten. Und das ist eine Diskussion, die wir schon...
And this is a discussion we've had beforehand. when about 5 years ago, I think it was in October, we were in Zurich. We had an opportunity to talk about it in more details. You have certain methodologies here, but I think this is not it's an important, but not the main question. We have to try and make sure that we get into the right direction here, and the financial streams have to be measured at very volatile entities who are called currencies. Environmental aspects are linked to nature aspects. It's tricky but feasible to link all these together, and it will be linked to this also. Important point here is not so much that we have the exactly precise equation for this. What's important is that according to the indication of Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement, we try as good as possible to have the financial streams reoriented in the right directions, transcribing the paragraph, because this goes for other environmental problems as well. So we have to try and make sure that we get a development where we have a much more qualitative approach than the purely quantitative approach linked to currency policies. So wealth has to be generated in a way that is compliant with the limited natural resources. And if we manage to do so, we will have an answer for that question as well. Quite simply, yes. I would say no, and yes. First question was in one sense. So, do you think we will get to the point where it will be consistent, casually traceable in detail what effect a financial product has on the environment? I don't think we'll get there. And as you said yourself, I'm not convinced it's necessary. It will be existing in certain specific cases, reminding me of the Church of Sweden as a Swedish investor, where a company has been convinced to reorient themselves because they had been put on their blacklist. A CEO coming to the church every Sunday and coming to his office on Monday, saying, "Okay, dear friends, we cannot be on the divestment list of the Church of Sweden. We have to change this." Maybe in individual cases this can be done, but not in a systemic way. And maybe it's not really necessary either. But on the risk side, it's different. I think that we have still a way to go, but there's no reason why we should not have systematically and with other calculation and technological methods and the possibility to identify the other way around in the causality chain, and this will lead us quite far. Maybe one comment, if I may, concerning MiFID. I have to say, here in this discussion today, also, it's a little bit a nuisance to me when I hear that we have a steep learning curve with these new sustainability rules, because the idea that investment objectives of small investors have to be integrated was in MiFID II already, and investment objectives not only financially. We've known that for 20 years. And it's simply a scandal of the whole topic. You have the impression that new rules have to be developed, and new learning aspects. No, fundamental principle of consumer protection, MiFID II anchoring small investors' objectives. They have been ignored by the legislators at the time, and the financial sector as well, because they were speculating that there would not be a follow-up for these rules and inclusion. And please remind everybody of that instead of wanting new rules all the time. I just wanted to indicate as internalizing external costs. You said that's quite true. If all countries in the world would be doing this, we would not need a sustainable finance. And sustainable finance is basically exporting good policy in that sense. It's our way to try and convince other countries, or our own countries as well, in order to have an effect that other policies did not manage to reach. And so it is clear that it's a quite difficult path to do it indirectly via the financing. But if we don't say it very clearly, well, we will certainly have deeply read scenario that Andrew Verona has shown to us. And maybe a last question to all of you. How important do you consider the standard structure of sustainable finance if we want to reach these objectives? And at the same time, should we try out other paths also to reach these objectives outside the financial world? So, Mr. Rebernig, you're also involved. Well, to be honest, I'm still hanging on to the preceding question and like to talk or answer it from the environmental agency point of view. Be it now a financial product having an impact or not, the question is rather, can I have a good evaluation at all of what's going on in the environment and what causalities might be given there? And here we've been learning quite a lot, and we know what economic activities, and finally it's about the financing of economic activities and what economic activities have what environmental impacts. We know a lot about this, but by far not enough, especially not when we have a fine granularity as would be needed here to see what the impact of financial products might be and how to evaluate them. Here it's even more complicated. But let me indicate, and in your initial statement you have mentioned a few instruments on the European level already. For instance, Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation or the CSR Directive, including all the standards. It's precisely about the fact that we want to have a much better, with a finer structure in the database, allowing us to see what really the impact of financial instruments might be here. In truth, this is a topic that environmental monitoring, in the sense of observing what changes are taking place in the environment and why they are intervening, and trying to have a projection or developing scenario how this would be in the future. Well, we had this in the first presentation by Mr. Ferrone, the building of scenario. Well, all these are core tasks that we can make available as environmental agencies, and then we need quite quickly a dialogue with the actors of the financial sector, finance sector, to find the same wording and have in the value chains from the origins to the impacts an excellent cooperation all along. I'd like to open up our discussion now to the whole audience. We have about 15 minutes for that, and then we can let the daylight come into the room again. Do have questions and comments from our audience, please. I'm a little bit late in discussion. My name is Stefan Kochos. I'm a director of several companies, mainly in transport and stocks sector. Well, personally, and my company also are bombarded with suggestions how ESG and compliance aspects, environmental matters should be treated in our sector. Transport and warehousing, there's about, I'm exaggerating, 50 labels we could have, the lean and green to EMDS or whatever they may be. So there's a lot of things having an effect on, that might have an impact on us, enforcing us a new path in the right direction, but there's no coherence. They expect reporting, they expect data collection, but there's no accounting report. So in the financial world, we have the standard account with all points that you might have in this area. Some are adequate, others not. But for environmental commitment, you don't have this. If each and everyone, I'm looking for the right term, if everybody had the same, let's say, standard reporting, and if you're asked to fill in the form according to the size of your company, but in the clusters of similar companies, you could see the possibility for real benchmarking, and you had an overlook for several years in a row, like for balance sheets, what's the developments. Why don't we have this? Since 1980, well, environment and other aspects have been indicated. Now we're 2023, quite a while, if you look at it. But where's the wormhole where we could get drafted into to progress in a quicker way in order to stop having an advancement here in sublight speed to remain in the Star Wars image. But short answer here, from my point of view, sustainability is a qualitative matter and finance is a quantitative area. And in the qualitative area, sustainability is seen differently from different people. Subjective, and quite rightly so, subjective points of view. And to create coherence here leads to a lot of costs. We see it in taxonomy. If everything is put into the same framework, reaction now without microphone, unfortunately. But this is one point. Second point, and I hear it quite a lot. Why don't we have this in the sustainability of financial content? I've been director of financial and accounting matters at a company as well, so it's not that consistent either. If you're honest here, yeah, the same figures. You can compare the accounts, but I'm there with accountants every year. I'm not in the financial administration here, but allow me to say, you're there. How can I book this and how can I put this into the sheets? And in traditional finance, stress test is also the case. It's more an art than a science. And then we can reach this coherence also in the midterm perspective, but politics have to create more streamlining and not always new measures. But we have to get away from the idea that qualitative things of importance to us. In the presentation, 80% of the slides were about life quality and nature quality, not about finance or economic consequences. And if we live in this area, we have to cope with the fact that quantitative and qualitative aspects of our life have different forms and different levels and types of coherence.
Exact.
Well, I did say so before. The answer is that when we talk about finance flows or financial accounting, we need to agree on currencies that are convertible. For environmental topics, that's more difficult. In the taxonomy, we agreed on 6 dimensions for sustainable development, not only environmental goals. We have the 17 sustainability goals and the 169 sub-goals. And it's obvious if you are a transport company, you may be concerned with the sustainability goal on, we're not so much concerned with water supplies who fall out of this category, but you are, and this is my moving back to you. You are in your sector. In your sector, you can set a benchmark. Also environmental benchmarks, and this is probably why we have this proliferation of labels, because every sector is saying, well, how can I make progress, and then a lean and green will be developed, and it all depends on the robustness. I mentioned the word robust before. It depends how robust the measurement of your environmental performance is. And if the measurement is robust, and you can buy something with that, and you can measure it from year on year. For climate protection, on the authority side, we're a bit farther than for the other objectives, but for climate protection, we also agreed globally that every country needs to do their commitments, and Green Deal Europe, Fit for 55, so a reduction objective, and every sector producing direct emissions can compare itself. So it's feasible. It's a long journey till we get there, and I don't think this is not the reason not to do it. But I do believe this exists. And it's not completely chaotic, but the answer is very straightforward. You have the impression you can add financial figures without any problem, and then things become comparable, but that's not the case. That's why I always say we need convertible currencies. This is where volatility starts. But we are not on a currency panel. If I may add just one thing, just an idea on this comment. I wrote a book last year on how many people I don't want to kill through sustainable action. This could be an indicator that every company publishes their kill score. The climate deaths they cause and the pollution deaths, these are convertible currencies. Those I've been talking to about this idea were not so enthusiastic about it, strangely enough, but there are some final effects which are very consistent, but they're very unpleasant. And there is a lobby that always says, well, we would like to have more consistency, but also happy that the comparability is as low as it is. If I now wear my hat of the Vice President of the Environmental Agency, the European Environmental Agency, we, for instance, in air pollution, we have this indicator. We don't measure the number of deaths, but those who died prematurely, the premature deaths. How many people died prematurely because of non-consistent implementation of the pollution prevention policy? So premature deaths in the various EU member states. And in the agency, we also broke it down and combined it with the living standard or the quality of life and poverty level. And it's really regrettable that these premature deaths mainly occur in poorer regions. And which brings us very quickly not only to purely environmental indicators. So things get complex very quickly, and that's the main response to your question. It's the complexity. It doesn't really allow developing straightforward indicators, but one can agree on a subset of a number of indicators. And as I said, 6 indicators for the taxonomy, climate protection, climate adjustment, biodiversity, water protection, protection of the ocean, circularity, and pollution prevention. So that's pretty clear and covers the 3 crises mentioned by the Minister. Thank you. It brings me to our next question, Mr. Rebernig. Please interrupt us and just shout into the room. Thank you, Elena Schmitz of the University of Luxembourg. If I may contradict you on the previous question, there is the idea already to put environmental and social indicators in one matrix. If you think of the welfare matrix of Christian Fellbach, the Austrian, the idea of the welfare economy, or the general common goods economy, there is one initiative after another. There is a sustainable finance conferences after another, but not enough has happened. This is not the first IPCC report that's being presented. Are we perhaps looking at the wrong places? Do we have a fault in the system? Are there some systemic barriers because of which we cannot measure impact like general good, but only quantitative financial risk? What's your opinion about that? Maybe Georg. Yes, says Georg. But Georg is muted now. We can't hear him. If I may. Great. Thank you very much. Maybe it's useful to differentiate here between what we know quantitatively, and as far as environmental topics are concerned, these are topics which are measurable quantitatively. As we've seen in the first presentation, it's about things like greenhouse emission equivalents, CO2, temperature increases, changes in nature. This can all be measured quantitatively. So the impacts, the physical, chemical, the atmospheric impacts, temperature, all this is quantifiable. And I think this is what we should do, because it's all about our physical environment. in which we, people and all other living beings, should be able to survive, continue to live, and under what conditions. And there's lots of figures and facts, and maybe there is a problem in the methodology that we just focus on headline indicators, that everything is summarized in headline indicators. But I don't think that's our problem. Our problem is the societal, and this brings me to the qualitative part. There are various preferences, different preferences, and assessment of usefulness. And the problem that you mentioned in your question is a societal issue, a political issue. We live in democracies, and when we make a decision, we need to have majorities and then implement our decision. And this is exactly the permanent negotiation that's taking place, which is more difficult to measure, certainly. And in that context, another remark, we as environmental agencies, and I can speak in the plural for the other colleagues, we as environmental officers, we are dealing not only with physical and chemical measurements, but also what happens in societies, in societal processes. What about awareness building? What about the awareness in the population? Can I measure that? Can I follow any developments there? And can I make any deductions and make recommendations to the politicians as to how they can handle these societal developments? Yes, I can fully support my colleague Georg Rebernig. I also wanted to add one point. In politics, or governments rather, or international organizations, or the EU, tries to use rules to react to the crisis. These rules are power-based sometimes, sometimes based, penally based, or a combination of both. But behind this, we have a societal development across society, which is difficult to pinpoint in these rules, in these regulations, but which plays an important role and needs to be questioned and should be questioned. And the concept of the common good economy is certainly one concept. Recently, 3 months ago, we were in a neighboring institution here where the Sustainability Council of Luxembourg and the Œuvre Grand Duchesse Charlotte, which is the largest welfare organization in Luxembourg, were invited us to an event, and they said there are so many plans and strategy. Let's do one, the donut economy, as developed by a Swedish economist, and the colleagues of one of the Belgian regions, Brussels capital, because they've included that now in their government program, the donut economy. So these are very interesting exercises, very interesting developments. I sometimes need to pick the wrong word in German because it's not my mother tongue. So very interesting exercises. So, or experiments, let's call it an experiment, a very interesting experiment to tackle things differently. And I think it's important that we should not only take this regulatory approach and technocratic approach as we did this morning, but that we also look at the societal questions. There should be room for that too. If we want to develop or implement a national energy and climate plan, we should not only ask ourselves whether everybody is on board, so just transition, but also how this transition is tackled in society. So these are some very interesting questions, and things happen more quickly than you think. We now have a small window of opportunity, but one day it will be too late because 2050 is almost tomorrow. And if we want to be climate neutral in 2040 or 2050, 2040 as the public administration in Luxembourg wants to do, 2040, then all these things need to be done over the next 2 years, otherwise it won't be working, and this is an extreme challenge. So the question about the system, this criticism of the system, it's a very fair question. I would be an impolite host if there are too many sustainable finance conferences. On the contrary, but maybe two ideas about this. I personally are relatively optimistic. 2 degrees is, I think, the worst case outcome, and this has horrendous consequences for large parts of this globe, which shows the power of the traditional capitalism, that to avoid the worst case. Maybe in the future, people will be looking at us like we look at Marx now, but these ideas have changed capitalism, and our finance does that too. This optimism doesn't change the fact that you have articulated there, and I would also like to support that. At the end, we think that via purely financial mechanisms, risk and ratios, we're going to achieve this objective. And this is not going to happen if we are not open to the public good, because many of the costs we are going to carry, whether it's the kill score, will never be recognized in the financial books of this world. But nevertheless, there will be negative consequences if we're not ready to open the path for this. These consequences will have to be borne. I think we can all build on our own power of conviction. We have been strengthened by this conference, and we can now go back to our world of work, to our families, and I hope that we can convince people there, all those that we know. And next year we meet again at our next conference,